Karen was known for being a bit of a troublemaker, but in a way that always managed to bring attention to her. She was the kind of person who liked to laugh, make jokes, and always be the center of attention at any gathering. Whether she was with friends or strangers, Karen knew how to make people laugh, even if it was at the expense of someone else. But she never thought her jokes could go too far. She thought of herself as someone who could always control the situation, even when things got out of hand. It was a sunny afternoon when Karen and her friends decided to visit the Royal Gardens, an area known for its beautiful views and high security. The Royal Guards, dressed in their formal uniforms, stood perfectly still, watching over the area with great care. They were part of a tradition, and many people admired their stoic presence. Karen had always found their seriousness a bit amusing. She thought it would be funny to do something unexpected, something that would break the tension and get a good laugh. It was all part of her plan to add a little excitement to the otherwise peaceful scene. Karen's friends, always eager to back up her wild ideas, encouraged her. They were convinced that the guards would either laugh it off or not react at all. But Karen didn't think too much about it. She had something in mind, a small bottle of liquid she had brought along. The bottle was clear, and Karen thought it looked harmless enough. It was the perfect prank material. She'd pour it on one of the guards, and everyone would laugh. She didn't think it through, didn't consider how serious the situation could become. To her, it was all just fun. As she approached one of the guards, Karen's heart raced with excitement. She moved quickly and poured the liquid onto his uniform, expecting him to flinch or maybe give her a surprised look. But instead, the guard let out a sharp cry of pain. Karen froze. The liquid wasn't water. It was something much more dangerous. Within seconds, the guard's face began to turn red, and the pain became obvious. His hand shot up to his face as he tried to wipe it off, but it was already too late. Karen's initial reaction was to laugh. She thought he was just overreacting. She couldn't believe that something so simple could cause such an outburst. But as she looked closer, the severity of the situation hit her. The guard was in agony, and his skin was burning. His colleagues quickly rushed over, and chaos erupted. Karen felt a wave of panic as she realized the joke had gone horribly wrong. The liquid wasn't harmless at all. It was a substance that could burn and scar. It was nothing like what she thought it would be. Her friends, who had been laughing just moments before, were now wide-eyed in shock. The crowd gathered around, some calling for help, others frozen in disbelief. Karen's heart sank. She didn't know what to do. Her joke had turned into something far more serious. She had hurt someone badly, and there was no going back. The royal guard, who had once stood tall and proud, was now in pain, and Karen was responsible. The laughter she had hoped for was nowhere to be found. Karen felt trapped in the moment, realizing that everything had just changed in a single thoughtless act. The excitement she had once felt quickly turned into dread, and she knew there was no way to undo what had been done. It wasn't just a harmless prank anymore. It was a mistake, one that would have consequences far beyond what she had imagined. The lightheartedness of the afternoon had vanished, replaced by the cold reality of what she had just caused. As the acid splashed across the guard's face, Karen immediately noticed his reaction, but she didn't fully understand the gravity of what had just happened. The guard's face twisted in pain, and his eyes widened in shock as he instinctively brought his hands to his face. For a moment, Karen stood still, confused. She thought he was just surprised, maybe irritated, but she couldn't have been more wrong. Within seconds, the guard's expression shifted from surprise to something much worse. Fear. The skin on his face started to redden rapidly, and then small patches began to blister. His hands frantically tried to wipe off the liquid, but it was clear that it wasn't something that could be simply wiped away. His distress was palpable as his face burned under the intense reaction to the chemical. He let out a sharp gasp, then an agonizing cry, which echoed through the surrounding area. Karen's eyes grew wide, as she finally realized that what she had thought was harmless liquid wasn't just a prank. It was something dangerous. The laughter that had bubbled up inside her moments before quickly died. The crowd around her had stopped laughing too. It was no longer a joke. It was a crisis. People began shouting for help. One of the other guards rushed to the scene, his face full of worry. He quickly called out to others, and within seconds, the area was filled with movement as medical personnel arrived. They started tending to the wounded guard, carefully trying to assess the damage. Karen's stomach turned as she watched the treatment process. The reality of what she had done hit her harder than anything else. She hadn't just caused a minor inconvenience or prank. She had hurt someone seriously. While the medics worked on the guard, Karen found herself paralyzed by shock. She had no idea what to say or how to fix things. She wanted to apologize, to somehow explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind raced, but it couldn't catch up with the horror she was now witnessing. The crowd around her murmured in disbelief, some of them pointing fingers, others simply staring in disbelief. Her friends, who had once egged her on, now stood silent. They too were stunned by what had happened. No one could have predicted that something so simple would spiral out of control so quickly. One of her friends, seeing how Karen was frozen in place, whispered, "You need to go. This is bad." Karen didn't know what to do. Her heart pounded in her chest. She was trying to process the situation, but it felt like the whole world was moving too fast. She glanced around, but everything seemed distant. The royal guards were gathering around the injured one, and Karen could see the seriousness in their faces. The joy of the moment had vanished entirely, replaced by the stark reality that she had made a terrible mistake. The injured guard was now being carefully moved away by the medical team. The acid had caused damage to his skin and left painful marks on his face. Karen couldn't stop looking at the burn marks that had formed almost instantly. She never imagined her harmless joke could cause such a thing. She took a step back, her mind whirling with panic. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was an incident that was beyond her control. People around her were starting to take out their phones, snapping pictures of the chaos unfolding. Karen didn't know how much time passed, but she could feel the weight of what she had done settle heavily on her shoulders. It wasn't just an embarrassing moment. It was a moment that would change everything. The guard had been hurt, and Karen knew, deep down, that her life would never be the same again. The consequences of her reckless action had already begun to unfold, and she couldn't escape what was coming next. The laughter, the fun, the excitement, all of it was gone in an instant, replaced by a sinking feeling in her chest. She could never undo what had just happened, and the thought of facing the fallout of her actions was enough to make her feel more lost than she had ever felt before. Karen stood there, frozen in place, her heart pounding as the scene around her unfolded in a blur of motion. The injured guard was quickly surrounded by medical professionals, who worked urgently to assess the damage and provide him with care. He was in obvious pain, his face flushed with redness, his hand still holding to the spot where the liquid had hit him. Karen felt like she was watching from a distance, her mind struggling to grasp the full reality of what was happening. The people around her had begun to whisper, some muttering in disbelief, while others openly stared at her. Karen's face turned pale, and for the first time, she realized that this wasn't just a harmless prank. She had done something far worse. It wasn't just an awkward moment or a little joke gone wrong. She had hurt someone, and the consequences of that were unfolding right before her eyes. As the minutes ticked by, Karen could see the urgency in the medic's movements. The guard, still in obvious discomfort, was being carefully moved away to be treated. The pain on his face was unmistakable, and Karen's stomach churned. She couldn't look away, but at the same time, she wanted to escape. She couldn't believe what she had just caused. All of her confidence in the harmlessness of her joke had disappeared in an instant. In its place was a deep sense of regret and dread that seemed to grow with every passing second. A few people had started to approach Karen, but she could hardly hear what they were saying. Some were asking her if she was okay. as though she were the one who needed help. Others were glaring at her, their eyes filled with judgment. It didn't take long for the reality to set in. Karen was the one at fault. She was the one who had made the decision to take things too far. And now she could see the pain she had caused. She had never intended for anyone to get hurt. It was supposed to be a harmless prank, just a way to get a laugh. But now, it was a disaster that she didn't know how to fix. Her friends, who had once been laughing alongside her, had gone quiet. They stood off to the side, unsure of what to do. One of them, seeing how badly Karen was reacting, stepped forward to try and comfort her. "Karen, we need to go. This is serious," her friend whispered. But Karen couldn't move. She couldn't take her eyes off the guard, who was now being tended to by the medics, his face still raw and red. Karen opened her mouth, trying to speak, to apologize, to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. How could she apologize for something so terrible? How could she make this right when she knew there was no way to undo the damage? She wanted to tell the guard how sorry she was, but she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. She had already gone too far. The crowd around her had grown. Some people had pulled out their phones, filming the chaos and capturing the moment. Karen felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. This wasn't just a private mistake. It was something that everyone was going to see. The story would spread quickly, and she didn't know how she would face anyone ever again. As the minutes passed, the reality of what had happened began to hit Karen like a heavy weight. She had thoughtlessly hurt someone in front of dozens of people, and now she would have to face the consequences. She tried to tell herself that it was an accident, that she hadn't meant to cause harm. But deep down, she knew it wasn't enough. The guard had been seriously injured, and there was no way to erase that. As the medics finally helped the guard to his feet and began to move him away from the scene, Karen stood motionless, trapped in her own regret. She could no longer ignore the fact that her careless actions had permanently changed someone's life. The guilt she felt in that moment was overwhelming, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the consequences of her mistake. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Karen couldn't believe what was happening. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. She stood there, still in shock, as the scene around her continued to spiral out of control. The Royal Guard, now receiving care, was moved to a safer location, but Karen couldn't take her eyes off the spot where it all happened. She felt an icy coldness wash over her, a mix of dread and regret. She had no idea how it had come to this. Soon, the police arrived, their presence adding to the growing tension. They quickly began to ask questions, taking statements from the witnesses. The people around Karen whispered among themselves, some still in disbelief about what had occurred. A few were now casting judgmental glances in her direction. Karen felt like she was being suffocated by the weight of their stares, each one more accusing than the last. When the police officers approached her, it was clear that they already knew what had happened. They were calm but serious as they asked her to step aside for questioning. Karen's mouth felt dry, and her hands trembled as she tried to speak. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she explain herself? How could she tell them that this was just a joke gone terribly wrong? She didn't know how to make sense of it herself, let alone explain it to someone else. The officers asked her what she had thrown on the guard's face, and Karen's mind raced. She had never thought about the consequences of her actions before. The liquid she had used wasn't something harmless as she had believed. It was something dangerous. She remembered the bottle now, the way it had glinted in the sun when she took it out. She had grabbed it in a rush, never even thinking to check what it was. She had assumed it was just a harmless prank, but now she realized how wrong she had been. As she tried to explain, the police officers listened carefully, their faces unreadable. They didn't speak much at first, but Karen could feel the tension building. She knew she was in serious trouble. She hadn't meant for anything bad to happen, but intent didn't matter in this situation. The guard had been injured, and it was clear that the consequences would be far-reaching. While the officers continued their investigation, Karen's thoughts were in a blur. She felt sick to her stomach. Her friends, who had been standing nearby, were now being questioned as well. They had been there when it all happened, and now they had to give their own accounts of what had gone on. Karen could hear snippets of their conversations, but it all felt distant, like she was no longer part of the world around her. She could only focus on what she had done, and how it had all gone so terribly wrong. A few people from the crowd were now openly criticizing Karen, their voices rising with anger and disbelief. One woman even asked, "How could you think that was funny?" Karen wanted to explain, to apologize, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. What she had done wasn't something that could be easily forgiven. The damage had been done, and there was no taking it back. As the situation grew more intense, Karen felt the reality of the consequences settling over her. It wasn't just about the prank anymore. The guard's injury was serious, and there was no telling how it would affect his life. She had never considered that something as simple as a joke could cause so much harm. It was a harsh wake-up call, and it hit her harder than she could have imagined. Eventually, Karen was asked to leave the scene and was escorted to a nearby police station. She could hear the sirens in the distance, and the world around her felt like it was closing in. Her mind was racing, but her thoughts were jumbled, as though she couldn't make sense of what had just happened. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life had changed in a way that she couldn't undo. The guilt, shame, and fear weighed heavily on her as she walked away from the scene, not knowing what would come next. The lightheartedness of the afternoon was gone, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of her actions. She couldn't shake the image of the guard's face, his pain, and the way everything had gone wrong so quickly. The thought of facing what was to come filled her with dread, and she realized that she was only beginning to understand the consequences of her reckless behavior. As Karen was escorted away from the scene by the police, her mind raced. She could barely process what was happening around her. The voices of people continued to echo in her ears, but it all felt distant, as if she were trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. The reality of the situation hit her with each step she took. She had hurt someone who was only doing their job, and now her actions were going to have consequences that stretched far beyond what she had ever imagined. The ride to the police station was long and silent. Karen sat in the back of the car, her hands trembling in her lap. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see the guard's face, his eyes wide with pain as the acid burned into his skin. She could still hear his cries for help, and the image of the medics quickly tending to him haunted her. She hadn't meant for any of it to happen. It had been a stupid joke, a prank she thought would get some laughs. But now she was sitting in the back of a police car, unsure of what was going to happen next. At the police station, Karen was led into a small room. The officers who had been questioning her earlier followed her inside. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and completely alone. They asked her to sit down, and for the first time, she realized how serious the situation was. The officers didn't need to say anything for Karen to understand. They were there to investigate, to determine the extent of the damage she had caused. They needed to know what the liquid was, how it had come into her possession, and why she thought it was okay to pour it on a person's face. Karen's mind was a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. She couldn't answer all of their questions. She could barely even speak without feeling her chest tighten. She hadn't thought about any of this when she made the decision to pull the prank. All she had wanted was some attention, a little excitement. But now she was facing the consequences of her thoughtless actions, and it felt like she was spiraling into something she couldn't control. The officers continued to ask questions, their tone professional but firm. They needed to know where she had gotten the liquid and how she had known it could cause harm. Karen explained that she had found the bottle in a store a few weeks ago, that it had seemed like just a harmless substance. She never intended for it to be dangerous. But the more she spoke, the more she realized that none of her explanations would matter. The damage had been done. The guard was hurt, and she couldn't take it back. As the hours passed, Karen began to feel the weight of what she had done. She thought about her family, her friends, and the life she had known up until that moment. Everything had been so carefree before, but now she was facing a situation that was far beyond her ability to fix. Her whole world had turned upside down, and there was no way to undo the harm she had caused. The police officers finally told her that they would be in contact once they had all the necessary information. But as they left the room, Karen was left alone with her thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about the guard. What would happen to him? Would he recover from the burns? And what would happen to her? What kind of consequences would she have to face for this mistake? The silence in the room was deafening. The reality of the situation was slowly starting to sink in. She had never imagined something so small, so thoughtless, could cause such a mess. The whole thing had started as a joke, but now it was a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Karen leaned back in the chair, her mind heavy with guilt. She thought about how everything had changed in the blink of an eye. One moment, she had been laughing and enjoying herself, and the next, she was sitting in a police station, facing the aftermath of her mistake. The consequences had only just begun, and she had no idea how bad things would get. But one thing was clear: her life would never be the same. The hours dragged on as Karen sat alone in the small, sterile room. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to echo in her mind, amplifying the overwhelming silence that surrounded her. She was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the guard's face, the pain that had spread across his skin as the acid burned into him. She couldn't escape the image, no matter how hard she tried. The reality of what she had done felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her with guilt. It wasn't long before the door opened, and one of the officers entered. He sat down across from her, his face calm and neutral, but his eyes were sharp. Karen tried to gather herself, but her voice caught in her throat when she attempted to speak. She wasn't sure what to expect, but part of her had hoped for some kind of reassurance. She thought maybe they would tell her it was all just a misunderstanding, that the consequences wouldn't be as serious as they seemed. But deep down, she knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The officer started by asking her about the liquid she had used. He wanted to know more about how she had come across it and whether she had any idea of its potential danger. Karen explained everything she could remember, but the more she spoke, the more she realized how little she knew about what had actually happened. She had thought it was harmless, but now she knew it wasn't. The officer took notes as she spoke, his expression never changing, but Karen could feel the weight of his scrutiny. It was clear that this was no small matter. As the questioning continued, Karen found herself becoming more and more overwhelmed. She had never been in trouble like this before. She had never imagined that one impulsive decision could change her life so completely. She thought about her family, her friends, and how they would react when they found out. How could she explain what had happened? How could she tell them that she had done something so reckless, something that had hurt someone in such a serious way? The thought made her stomach twist in knots. The officer's questions became more direct. He asked about her intentions, whether she had meant to harm the guard, and if she understood the consequences of her actions. Karen didn't know how to answer. She had never meant for anything bad to happen. It had been a joke, a foolish, thoughtless joke, but now it was so much more than that. She had hurt someone, and there was no way to undo it. The officer didn't seem angry, but there was a quiet intensity in his manner, as though he was trying to understand how something like this could happen. As the questioning ended, Karen was told that she would have to wait for further instructions. The officer left the room, and once again, Karen was left alone with her thoughts. She could hear the distant sounds of people talking outside the room, but it all seemed so far away. Her mind raced, replaying the events of that afternoon over and over again. How had it come to this? How had she let a simple prank turn into something that could ruin her life? Karen had never been one to think things through, to consider the consequences before acting. She had always been impulsive, quick to make decisions without fully understanding what they might mean. But now, as she sat there, She realized just how important it was to think before acting. Her actions had consequences, and she was now facing the full weight of them. The guard was hurt, and there was no escaping the fact that she had caused it. She thought about what would happen next. The police investigation would continue, and the guard would have to go through his own healing process. Karen had no idea what her future held, but she knew one thing for sure: her life would never be the same. She had taken something simple and turned it into something dangerous, and now there was no going back. The reality of her mistake had fully set in, and it was more overwhelming than she could have ever imagined. The next few days were a blur for Karen. After the police questioning, she had been allowed to return home, but the weight of what she had done lingered over her like a constant storm cloud. Her family had been notified about the incident, and the shame she felt in their eyes was unbearable. Her mother, usually so understanding, had barely spoken to her. Her father had been quiet too, his expression unreadable. Karen didn't know how to face them, and the silence at home was deafening. She had never felt so alone. Her phone buzzed several times with messages from her friends, but she couldn't bring herself to look at them. Some messages were filled with concern, asking if she was okay, but others were full of questions she didn't know how to answer. They all wanted to know what happened, why it happened, and how she was feeling, but Karen wasn't sure how to explain herself. She didn't know how to make sense of it either. The guilt gnawed at her, and the fear of what was coming next kept her awake at night. She had no idea how bad the consequences were going to be. In the days that followed, news of the incident spread. It wasn't long before people started talking about it in her town. The royal guard was a well-known figure, and his injury had caught the attention of many. Karen couldn't escape the whispers. Everywhere she went, people gave her strange looks. Some of them were filled with judgment, while others just seemed curious, wondering what had really happened. Karen hated the attention. She wanted to hide, to disappear from the world for just a little while. But she couldn't. It was all out there now, and there was no going back. The worst part was not knowing what was going to happen to the guard. She had never intended to hurt him, but the acid had done real damage. She had seen the pictures online, and the burns on his face were serious. She couldn't stop thinking about how much pain he must have been in. It was all her fault. She had hurt him in a way that would take time to heal, both physically and emotionally. Every time she thought about it, a sharp pang of regret shot through her heart. How could she have been so thoughtless? Karen's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She thought about the police investigation, about what kind of legal consequences she might face. Would she be charged with something? How serious would the punishment be? She couldn't help but wonder if her whole life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. She didn't know what would happen to her future, but it didn't seem like it would be a bright one. Her friends continued to reach out to her, but Karen didn't know how to face them either. She couldn't explain what she had done, not in a way that would make sense. The thought of seeing them, of facing their disappointment, made her stomach churn. How could she face anyone after what she had done? How could she look them in the eye when she had caused so much pain, even though it had all been an accident? It wasn't just her family and friends that Karen had to worry about. The attention from the public only intensified as the days passed. News outlets began to report on the incident, and social media was filled with discussions about the prank gone wrong. The royal guard, despite his injuries, was still in the public eye. People were outraged by what had happened, and Karen became the subject of many conversations, none of them positive. Her name was now linked to a serious mistake, and she couldn't escape the consequences, no matter how hard she tried. As the days stretched into weeks, Karen's fear and guilt grew. The police had said they would be in touch, but she hadn't heard anything new. She didn't know if they were still investigating, or if a decision had already been made about her case. Each day brought more uncertainty, and with it the realization that this wasn't something she could just forget. It wasn't something she could fix with an apology or by trying to explain herself. The damage had been done, and now she had to face it. Karen had no idea how long it would take for things to settle, or if they ever would. She knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. Her world had been turned upside down in the blink of an eye, and now she had to live with the consequences of her actions. The weight of that was heavy on her shoulders, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could bear it. As the weeks went by, Karen's life continued to spiral. The weight of what she had done became even harder to bear with each passing day. The endless cycle of thoughts, regret, guilt, and fear kept her up at night. It felt like everything around her was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The world she had once known seemed so far away now, as if she had entered a new reality where every mistake was magnified, and the consequences were far worse than she ever imagined. Karen had heard from the police a few times during this period, but each time the calls only served to heighten her anxiety. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she feared the worst. What if the legal consequences were more serious than she thought? What if her life would be forever tainted by this one mistake? It felt like she was walking on a tightrope, unsure of when it would all come crashing down. The royal guard had recovered physically, but the emotional toll of what had happened was clear. News outlets continued to report on the incident, but they had moved on to other stories. Despite that, Karen couldn't escape the feeling that everyone was still watching her, still judging her for what she had done. Her family, her friends, and even strangers. They all had opinions, and they all made her feel like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. It was hard to remember a time when she didn't feel like she was constantly under a microscope. Then, one morning, she received a letter in the mail. She had been expecting it, but the moment she saw the envelope, her heart sank. It was from the police, and she knew it wasn't going to be good news. Her hand shook as she tore it open, the words inside confirming her worst fears. The letter detailed the charges against her and explained that the royal guard had decided to press charges for the harm she had caused. There was no turning back now. The legal system would now decide her fate. Karen's first reaction was to feel numb. She had always thought that something like this wouldn't happen to her. She had never imagined that a joke, a harmless prank, could turn into something so serious. But now, as the reality of the situation hit her, she realized just how wrong she had been. The guard had been injured, and despite her intentions, that was something that couldn't be undone. The letter outlined the next steps in the legal process, and Karen's heart ached as she read through it. The charges were serious, and there was a real chance she could face jail time, or at least a heavy fine. Karen didn't know what to do. She felt helpless, trapped by her own mistake. She couldn't talk her way out of this, no matter how sorry she was. She had hurt someone, and now the consequences of that were unfolding in front of her. She thought about how things had been before this all happened, before she made the decision to throw that acid as a joke. Back then, life had seemed so simple. But now, everything was complicated, and the future felt uncertain. In the days that followed, Karen's emotions were all over the place. Some days, she felt a glimmer of hope, thinking that maybe there was still a chance to fix things. Other days, she was overwhelmed by a sense of despair, wondering if she would ever be able to move on from this. She spent time with her family, trying to hold on to some semblance of normalcy, but it wasn't easy. They were supportive, but the strain of the situation was clear. The trust between them had been shaken, and Karen wasn't sure if things would ever be the same. Her friends had also drifted away. They had stopped texting and calling, and Karen couldn't blame them. She knew they were disappointed in her, just like everyone else. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone, but it didn't change the fact that she had. She had made a terrible decision, and now she had to live with it. As the legal process continued, Karen found herself coming to terms with the fact that there were some things in life that couldn't be fixed. Some mistakes were too big to simply apologize for or move on from. She had learned it the hard way. Her once carefree life had been shattered, and it was up to her to rebuild it from the ground up. But no matter how much time passed, the lesson she had learned would stay with her forever. In the end, Karen didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know how the legal proceedings would turn out or if she would ever fully heal from the guilt that weighed her down. But one thing was certain: she would never forget the consequences of her actions. The joke she had thought was harmless had changed everything, and now she had to face the aftermath. It wasn't going to be easy, but Karen knew that if she could survive this, she would come out stronger, with a deeper understanding of the weight of her choices.